In The Professional Guinea Pig, Roberto Abadi argues that human subjects enrolled in Phase 1 trials should be classified as workers. A Phase 1 trial is designed to test the safety as opposed to the efficacy of an experimental drug. Its main objectives are to discover any side effects and to better understand how the body metabolizes the drug. Unlike participants in later phases, who typically stand to benefit from the drug, participants in Phase 1 trials do it mainly for the money, often because they have few other options, their involvement constituting not so much an instance of altruistic volunteering as an economic draft. Increasingly, the pharmaceutical industry is outsourcing clinical trials to such places as China, India, and Eastern Europe, where there is a surplus of economically desperate people whose bodies are said to have the added advantage, from the perspective of the industry, of being relatively free from other drugs that might interact with the experimental drug. In the United States and countries with similar laws, participation in clinical trials is not classified as work, at least not insofar as labor laws are concerned. In response to this lack of labor rights, several scholars have argued that participating in Phase 1 trials ought to be regarded as a form of experimental or clinical labor. And I'm quoting certain authors, but I'm not going to tell you each time I'm quoting for the sake of time. Before a drug may legally be tested on humans in Phase 1 trials, it must first be tested for toxicity on non-human animals in what's called the preclinical phase. The purpose of preclinical toxicity testing is to reduce the risk to which human subjects in Phase 1 trials are subjected. This connection between human and non-human subjects raises an intriguing question. If human guinea pigs are engaged in clinical labor, what about actual guinea pigs? To date, scholars working on the concept of clinical labor have had little to say about non-human animals, and most scholars who've written about lab animals have classified them as living laboratory equipment rather than laborers. In this talk, I take up the question of whether it makes sense, both analytically and politically, to regard the participation of non-human animals in preclinical toxicity testing as a form of clinical labor. One of the hallmarks of critical animal studies is its engagement with Marxist categories such as labor. Yet much of Marx's thought is firmly anchored in a paradigm of human exceptionalism that's inconsistent with what we're learning about the lives of other animals. Given that one of the main goals of critical animal studies is to interrogate human exceptionalism, what's needed is not simply an application of Marx's categories to non-human animals, but a reconstruction of those categories in post-humanist terms. We need a more than human Marx, a post-humanist political economy. Exploring the possibility that humans may not be the only lab animals engaged in clinical labor is as good a place to start as any. Donna Haraway's explored this possibility in her work. The post-humanist whispering in my ear reminds me that animals work in labs, she writes, but not under conditions of their own design, and that Marxist humanism is no more help for thinking about this for either people or other animals than other kinds of humanist formulae. Using the concept of labor to describe what human subjects do and have done to them already stretches Marx's categories, arguing that non-human lab animals' labor too bends them beyond the breaking point. That's because using the concept to classify what non-human animals do, let alone what they have done to them, runs up against the human exceptionalism that undergirds Marx's analysis of the labor process. So a little about human exceptionalism. Humans are, of course, unique, if by this we mean having certain capabilities that other species lack. The same goes for every species, Tim Ingold reminds us, each of which is unique in its own particular way. Uniqueness, in other words, is not unique. But being unique is not the same as being exceptional, which means better than, not just different from, the rest. As Laurie Gruen explains, the ideology of human exceptionalism suggests not just that we engage in uniquely human activities, but that our uniqueness elevates us above animals. Though there are many ways that humans are different from other animals, she explains, the truly problematic feature of human exceptionalism is its second implicit claim, the normative claim that elevates humans above other animals. Mistaken claims about uniqueness often take the form of denials of evolutionary continuity. The anti-Darwinian view that humans are different in kind rather than in degree from other animals is a powerful conceit, James Gould and Carol Gould write, but it does not stand up to scrutiny. Yet even if one manages to avoid this empirical error, one is still engaging in human exceptionalism if one uses differences in degree to elevate human beings above other animals. Scholars have criticized Marx for putting forward an exclusively human form of labor that may not, in fact, be exclusive to humans, and for elevating human labor above that of all other animals. Here I focus on Marx's claims about the uniqueness of human labor. For Marx, the labor process as part of our species' inescapable metabolic relation with the rest of nature. Just to go on living, we must labor, transforming nature to meet our needs. As he puts it, labor is a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. He confronts the materials of nature as a force of nature. He sets in motion the natural forces which belong to his own body, his arms, legs, head, and hands, in order to appropriate the materials of nature in a form adapted to his own needs. Through this movement, he acts upon external nature and changes it, and in this way he simultaneously changes his own nature. He develops the potentiality slumbering within nature and subjects the play of its forces to his own sovereign power. Here, Marx is not describing a metabolic relation between human beings and nature. He's describing a relation within nature, between different parts of it. The goal of the labor process, as he describes it, is to transform external nature, understood as some part of nature outside the laborer's own body. In the process of transforming external nature, the laborer's internal nature is also transformed, but the laborer's body is not the object of his or her labor. Marx divides the labor process into three main elements. Purposeful activity, that is the work itself, the object on which that work is performed, and the instruments with which the work is done. Taken together, the instruments and objects of labor constitute the means of production. In the labor process, Marx explains, man's activity via the instruments of labor affects an alteration in the object of labor which was intended from the outset. The product of the process is a use value, a piece of natural material adapted to human needs by means of a change in its form. Marx uses non-human animals as examples to explain how the exclusively human form of labor works. He classifies uncaught fish as objects of labor, domesticated animals as instruments. What's most notable about Marx's examples, however, is that non-human animals are always classified as means of production. They are never laborers who work alongside human beings. This brings us to the first element, purposeful activity. We're not the only organisms who transform external nature and are themselves transformed in the process. But what Marx is primarily interested in is what he describes as the exclusively human form of labor. What makes this type of labor exclusively human, and what elevates it above what Marx describes as those first instinctive forms of labor which remain on the animal level, is that, unlike non-human laborers, human laborers are able to transform nature according to a mental blueprint. He makes this distinction by famously contrasting the architect with the bee. He writes, "A spider conducts operations which resemble those of the weaver, and the bee would put many a human architect to shame by the construction of its honeycomb cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is that the architect builds the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. At the end of every labor process, a result emerges which had already been conceived by the worker at the beginning, hence already existed ideally. Man not only effects a change of form in the materials of nature, he also realizes his purpose in those materials." So to summarize, for Marx, it's not labor that sets us apart. He acknowledges that at least some other animals labor too. But they do so instinctively, he argues, and only humans are able to plan the transformation of nature. When engaged in this exclusively human form of labor, the laborer first creates a mental blueprint of the use value that the laborer wants to create, and then the laborer sets out, wielding one or more instruments, to attempt to transform some external object into that use value. It's the planning that, for Marx, makes this form of labor uniquely human. So there have been many critiques of Marx. Anthropologist Tim Ingold has offered the most sustained critique of how non-human animals figure in Marx's analysis of the labor process. By characterizing the labor of non-human animals as instinctive, Ingold argues, Marx denies their capacity to engage in purposive labor. By purposive, Ingold does not mean purposeful, at least not in Marx's sense of following a mental blueprint. He means that, in the process of transforming nature, the laborer is conscious of what he or she is doing. For all his disagreement with Marx, however, Ingold ultimately agrees that Marx's architect is engaged in an exclusively human form of labor. That human labor is different in kind, not simply in